The countdown clock in CNN Studio 7 displayed 30 seconds in glowing red digits, each number a heartbeat away from what would become one of the most consequential exchanges in recent American political television. The studio lights cast sharp shadows across the polished mahogany desk, where two figures sat in leather chairs that had hosted presidents, premiers, and power brokers for over a decade. Justice Clarence Thomas adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to commanding every room he entered. At 76, his presence still commanded immediate attention. Broad shoulders squared beneath an impeccably tailored navy suit, silver hair precisely groomed, and eyes that had gazed down from the highest court in the land for more than 3 decades. He carried himself with the unshakable confidence of someone who had never been successfully challenged in a public forum, someone whose word was, quite literally, constitutional law. Across from him, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett appeared almost deceptively serene. At 40, she possessed the kind of focused calm that experienced trial lawyers cultivate, a stillness that masked razor-sharp preparation beneath. Her burgundy blazer was elegant but practical, chosen to convey both professionalism and accessibility to the folks back home in Dallas. What drew the eye, however, was the manila folder resting on her lap, its contents concealed but somehow radiating significance like a loaded weapon kept safely holstered. 10 seconds, the floor director whispered, raising his hand. Thomas glanced sideways at his younger counterpart with what could charitably be called benevolent amusement. In his experience, these congressional upstarts, particularly the ones who had ridden the wave of recent electoral changes, rarely possessed the intellectual depth or historical perspective necessary for serious constitutional discourse. They made for easy targets in debates, more concerned with sound bites than substance. This would be, he anticipated, another opportunity to educate both his opponent and the viewing public about the real foundations of American jurisprudence. Crockett, meanwhile, seemed absorbed in something far beyond the studio's confines, her gaze fixed on a middle distance that suggested deep thought rather than nervousness. She had spent 3 sleepless nights preparing for this moment, but not in the way Thomas might have expected. While he had likely refreshed his standard talking points about constitutional originalism and judicial restraint, she had been following paper trails, cross-referencing financial disclosures, and building a case that would have made her proud during her days prosecuting white-collar defendants. And we're live in 3, 2. The red light atop camera 2 blazed to life as anchor Anderson Cooper's voice filled millions of homes across America. Good evening, and welcome to this special edition of CNN Tonight. I'm Anderson Cooper. Tonight, we're examining constitutional principles and respect for institutions with 2 distinguished guests who bring very different perspectives to these crucial questions. The camera swept to Thomas first, capturing him in his element, authoritative, dignified, every inch the senior statesman. With us tonight is Associate Justice Clarence Thomas of the United States Supreme Court, appointed by President George H.W. Bush in 1991 and a towering figure in conservative constitutional interpretation. Thomas nodded acknowledgement with practiced humility, though his eyes betrayed satisfaction at the introduction's deference. And Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of Texas' 30th District, a civil rights attorney and rising voice in the Democratic Party who has made government accountability a cornerstone of her legislative agenda. Crockett smiled warmly at the camera, but those who knew her well might have noticed something predatory lurking behind the expression, the look of someone who had spotted weakness in an opponent's case and was simply waiting for the right moment to strike. Cooper continued, "Tonight, we're discussing constitutional principles, institutional respect, and the obligations of public service. Justice Thomas, I'd like to begin with your perspective on how younger generations of politicians approach these foundational concepts." But Thomas was already leaning forward, his expression shifting from ceremonial politeness to something more pointed. He had clearly decided to abandon the pretense of responding to questions and instead deliver the lecture had been formulating since learning of tonight's format. "Anderson, if I may," Thomas began, his voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench. "I think what we're seeing today represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what genuine struggle for constitutional rights actually entails." He turned slightly toward Crockett, though his words were ostensibly directed at the camera. "Too many young politicians today, and I use that term advisedly, seem to believe that the freedoms and opportunities they enjoy simply materialized out of thin air. They treat as commonplace achievements that required generations of sacrifice, dedication, and yes, genuine suffering to secure. Crockett maintained her serene expression, though her fingers drummed once, just once, against the manila folder. Thomas, lost in his own rhetorical momentum, missed the tell entirely. The civil rights movement wasn't built on complaints and grievances, Thomas continued, his tone growing more professorial and condescending with each word. It was built on personal responsibility, individual excellence, and the determination to prove oneself worthy of the freedoms being claimed. When I was coming up, and this was real struggle, not the manufactured outrage we see today, we understood that respect had to be earned through merit, through character, through demonstrable achievement. The words hung in the air like incense in a cathedral, heavy with the weight of assumed moral authority. Thomas sat back slightly, clearly expecting acknowledgement of his wisdom, perhaps even grateful deference from his younger colleague. Instead, Crockett continued studying her folder with the focused attention of someone reading a particularly interesting document. When she finally looked up, her expression remained unchanged, still pleasant, still professional, but now with something else underneath. Something that made Thomas unconsciously straighten in his chair. "What troubles me most," Thomas pressed on, apparently interpreting her silence as validation, "is this modern tendency to explain away personal shortcomings by blaming systemic issues. In my day, we didn't have the luxury of attributing our failures to abstract concepts like institutional bias or structural inequities. We had to succeed or fail based on our own efforts, our own character, our own worthiness." He paused for what he clearly believed would be dramatic effect, then delivered what he evidently considered his masterstroke. "I fear that many contemporary politicians, particularly those who have benefited from, shall we say, alternative pathways to advancement, don't fully appreciate the difference between earned success and gifted opportunity." The studio fell silent except for the barely audible hum of electronic equipment. Even Cooper seemed momentarily stunned by the audacity of what had just been implied on national television. The suggestion hung between the two guests like a gauntlet thrown down on medieval battleground, unmistakably deliberate, impossible to ignore. Crockett finally looked up from her folder, and for the first time since the broadcast began, she smiled. It was not the warm, media-trained expression she'd offered the camera moments earlier. This smile belonged in a courtroom, worn by a prosecutor who had just watched the defendant perjure himself so thoroughly that the case had essentially argued itself. "That's fascinating, Justice Thomas," she said, her voice carrying a honeyed quality that somehow made it more dangerous rather than less. "I find it particularly interesting to hear lectures about personal responsibility and earned success from someone who has made quite a comfortable living accepting expensive gifts from billionaire benefactors." The temperature in Studio 7 seemed to drop 10 degrees in the space between her words and Thomas' reaction. His face, which had moments earlier radiated comfortable superiority, now registered something between confusion and alarm. This was not how these conversations were supposed to proceed. Young politicians were meant to defer to his experience, to accept his critique with appropriate humility, to perhaps offer weak protestations that he could easily bat away with additional wisdom. They were certainly not supposed to possess detailed knowledge of his private affairs. "I beg your pardon?" Thomas managed, though his voice had lost its earlier authority. Crockett's smile widened just a fraction, and she lifted the manila folder slightly, not opening it, not threatening with it, simply acknowledging its presence like a poker player who had just decided to see the bet. "Oh, I think you heard me correctly, Justice Thomas. But don't worry. We'll have plenty of time to discuss the finer points of personal responsibility and institutional respect. After all, that's why we're both here tonight, isn't it? To examine how our public servants actually live up to the principles they claim to represent." Thomas stared at her across the narrow space between their chairs, and for the first time in decades, found himself completely uncertain about how to proceed. The young congresswoman continued smiling that unsettling smile, the folder resting casually in her lap, like a sleeping predator that might wake at any moment. In living rooms across America, viewers leaned forward in their chairs, sensing that they were about to witness something unprecedented. The evening that had begun as a standard political discussion was transforming into something else entirely, something that would be replayed, analyzed, and debated for years to come. And Justice Clarence Thomas, who had entered the studio expecting to deliver a comfortable lecture to a grateful audience, suddenly realized he might have made the most serious miscalculation of his very long career. The silence that followed Crockett's opening salvo stretched for exactly 7 seconds, an eternity in television time, where dead air feels like a cardinal sin. Anderson Cooper glanced between his guests, recognizing the shift in atmospheric pressure that veteran journalists learn to detect before major revelations explode across their programming. Justice Thomas recovered first, though his recovery bore little resemblance to his earlier commanding presence. His shoulders had drawn inward slightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried a defensive edge that millions of viewers had never heard from the Supreme Court's most senior conservative justice. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, attempting to reassert control through formality, "I find it deeply troubling that you would choose to engage in personal attacks rather than substantive constitutional discussion. This kind of character assassination represents exactly the decline in political discourse that personal attacks." Crockett interrupted smoothly, her voice retaining that dangerously pleasant quality. "Justice Thomas, I'm simply discussing public records and legal obligations. Surely someone of your judicial experience understands the difference between accountability and assassination?" She opened the manila folder with deliberate precision, the soft whisper of paper against paper somehow amplified in the studio's acoustic environment. The movement drew every eye in the room. Cameras, crew members. Even Cooper found himself leaning forward to catch a glimpse of whatever arsenal she had assembled. "But you raise an excellent point about substantive discussion," Crockett continued, extracting a document that bore the unmistakable letterhead of federal disclosure forms. "So let's discuss substance. Let's discuss, for instance, your relationship with Dallas businessman Harlan Crow." Thomas's face underwent a subtle but unmistakable transformation. The confident statesman expression that had carried him through 3 decades of public appearances flickered like a candle in wind. "My personal friendships are not personal friendships that include luxury vacations valued at hundreds of thousands of dollars." Crockett's voice maintained its professional calm even as she delivered what felt like a surgical strike. "Private jet travel to exotic destinations? Stays at exclusive resorts that most Americans couldn't afford if they saved for a lifetime?" She pulled out a second document, then a third, arranging them on her lap like playing cards. Each page represented hours of meticulous research, Freedom of Information Act requests, financial disclosure cross-references, and the kind of investigative patience that had made her reputation as a prosecutor. All gifts that, according to federal law, should have been disclosed on your annual financial reports, she continued. Gifts that, curiously, seem to have escaped mention in your official filings for years. Thomas's attempt at interruption came out as more of a sputter. "These are private matters between friends, and I resent the implication, private matters." Crockett's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "Justice Thomas, surely you understand that Supreme Court justices don't have private matters when it comes to financial benefits from individuals with interests before the court? The American people have a right to know when their justices are accepting valuable gifts from wealthy benefactors." She lifted another document, this one bearing photographs that had been obtained through investigative journalism. "Should we discuss the private school tuition for your grandnephew? Also courtesy of Mr. Crow's generosity? Or perhaps the real estate transactions involving your mother's property?" With each revelation, Thomas seemed to shrink further into his leather chair. The commanding presence that had intimidated lawyers and influenced American jurisprudence for decades was crumbling in real time, replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like a cornered animal. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Thomas managed, his voice rising with desperation. "This is character assassination disguised as oversight. You're attempting to impugn the integrity of the Supreme Court itself through baseless insinuations and baseless." Crockett's interruption carried the force of someone who had spent years destroying defendants' credibility with precisely documented evidence. "Justice Thomas, everything I've mentioned is documented in public records, financial disclosures, and investigative reports. If calling attention to publicly available information constitutes character assassination, then perhaps the problem isn't the information itself." Thomas straightened in his chair, attempting to resurrect his judicial authority. "Young lady, you seem to forget that you're speaking to a sitting justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. The institution I represent deserves your respect, regardless of whatever political grievances you may harbor." The phrase "young lady" seemed to electrify the studio atmosphere. Even Cooper, veteran of countless political confrontations, visibly tensed at the condescending dismissal. But if Thomas expected Crockett to be cowed by his positional authority, he had made perhaps his second serious miscalculation of the evening. Justice Thomas, Crockett replied, her voice now carrying a crystalline clarity that cut through pretense like a scalpel through tissue. I have tremendous respect for the Supreme Court as an institution. That's precisely why I'm troubled by justices who seem to believe they're above the ethical standards that govern every other public servant in America. She leaned forward slightly, and her next words carried the weight of constitutional scholarship. You seem to have forgotten that Congress has explicit oversight responsibilities regarding all branches of government, including the judiciary. The system of checks and balances doesn't work if no one is willing to check the balance. Though Ma's face flushed, the whether from embarrassment or anger remained unclear. The independence of the judiciary is fundamental to our constitutional system. Congress cannot and should not. Independence doesn't mean immunity from ethical standards, Crockett shot back. It doesn't mean justices can accept lavish gifts without disclosure. It doesn't mean the American people have no right to know when their highest court's decisions might be influenced by personal financial relationships. She pulled out yet another document, this one bearing the seal of the Judicial Conference. The very body that sets ethical guidelines for federal judges has repeatedly emphasized the importance of financial transparency. Yet somehow, you seem to believe these rules don't apply to you. Thomas was now visibly struggling. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. In desperation, he reached for what he clearly considered his trump card, an appeal that had often silenced critics in the past. Congresswoman, he said, his voice taking on a tone of wounded dignity, I'm deeply disappointed to see a successful black woman attacking a black man who has spent his entire career breaking barriers and creating opportunities for our community. We should be supporting each other, not tearing each other down in pursuit of political points. The words hung in the air like a challenge, an attempt to reframe the entire conversation around racial loyalty rather than ethical accountability. For a moment, the studio fell completely silent, as if everyone present recognized they were witnessing a Rubicon moment, a line being crossed that would fundamentally alter the nature of what was happening. Crockett's response, when it came, was delivered with the kind of controlled fury that experienced trial lawyers learn to weaponize. Justice Thomas, she said, her voice dropping to just above a whisper, but somehow carrying more force than if she had shouted, let me be absolutely clear about something. My race does not give you immunity from accountability. My race does not require me to provide cover for ethical failures. And my race certainly doesn't obligate me to remain silent while you damage the very institution you claim to serve. She stood up slightly in her chair, her posture radiating the kind of authority that comes from absolute moral certainty. You want to talk about our community? Let's talk about how your decisions on voting rights have disproportionately harmed the very black voters you claim to represent. Let's discuss how your rulings on criminal justice have perpetuated systems that devastate black families. Let's examine how your positions on civil rights have undermined decades of progress that other black leaders sacrificed everything to achieve. The camera caught Thomas' face in profile, and viewers could see the exact moment when he realized that the racial solidarity card had not only failed but had actually made his position worse. Crockett was no longer simply questioning his ethics, she was systematically dismantling his entire claim to represent black interests. When you accept luxury gifts from wealthy white benefactors while ruling against the interests of working black families, Crockett continued, you don't get to hide behind racial solidarity. When you consistently vote to restrict voting rights that black people bled to secure, you don't get to claim community kinship. And when you benefit personally from relationships with individuals who have business before your court, you don't get to suggest that criticism is somehow racial betrayal. Thomas made one final, desperate attempt to regain control. You have no idea what sacrifices I've made for this country, what I've endured to reach this position. You're too young, too privileged to understand what real struggle looks like. Everything you have, everything you've achieved, has been built on foundations that my generation laid through blood, sweat, and genuine sacrifice. It was his last card, and he played it with the fervor of someone who genuinely believed it might save him. The appeal to generational suffering, to earned wisdom, to the sacrifices of his journey from poverty in Georgia to the highest court in the land. Crockett smiled again, but this time the expression carried something different, not predatory calculation, but genuine sadness mixed with steely resolve. Justice Thomas, she said quietly, let me tell you about sacrifice. Real sacrifice is working for $174,000 a year when you could be making millions in private practice. Real sacrifice is choosing public service over personal enrichment. Real sacrifice is maintaining your principles even when wealthy benefactors offer you luxury and comfort in exchange for your integrity. She gestured toward the documents spread across her lap. What you call sacrifice, I call trading your principles for a more comfortable lifestyle. What you call struggle, I call the natural consequence of choices you made long after you had the power to choose differently. The words landed with devastating precision. Thomas sat frozen, his face reflecting the dawning realization that he had not only lost the argument, but had been systematically dismantled by someone he had dismissed as unworthy of serious consideration. The real tragedy, Crockett continued, isn't that you've compromised your position for personal benefit. The real tragedy is that you've used your incredible personal story, your genuine struggle to rise from poverty, as a shield to protect behavior that would be unacceptable from any other public servant. She began gathering her documents with calm efficiency, each movement deliberate and final. You've taken the inspiring narrative of a poor black child who overcame tremendous obstacles to reach the highest levels of American government, and you've used it to justify accepting gifts that most Americans couldn't afford in a lifetime of honest work. Thomas appeared to be trying to formulate a response, but words seemed to have abandoned him entirely. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a man drowning in shallow water. That's not sacrifice, Justice Thomas, Crockett concluded, her voice carrying a note of finality that signaled the end of something larger than just a television appearance. That's betrayal. Betrayal of the principles you swore to uphold, betrayal of the institution you claim to serve, and betrayal of the community you pretend to represent. The studio fell completely silent except for the barely audible hum of equipment and the soft whisper of paper as Crockett closed her manila folder. She sat back in her chair with the satisfied calm of someone who had just completed a necessary but unpleasant task. Thomas remained motionless, staring at some fixed point beyond the cameras, his face reflecting the shell-shocked expression of someone who had just watched his carefully constructed public persona crumble in real time before an audience of millions. Anderson Cooper, veteran of countless political confrontations, found himself temporarily speechless in the face of what he had just witnessed. This hadn't been a typical political debate or even a heated argument between ideological opponents. This had been something far rarer and more devastating, a complete and methodical destruction of someone's public credibility using nothing but documented facts and moral clarity. In living rooms across America, viewers sat transfixed, many reaching for their phones to confirm what they had just seen. Social media began exploding with clips, commentary, and analysis, but the consensus was immediate and overwhelming. They had just witnessed something unprecedented in modern American political discourse. A young black woman from Texas had just held the most powerful black conservative in America accountable for his actions, using the very tools of democracy that he had spent decades limiting. She had done it without raising her voice, without personal insults, without anything but documented evidence and unwavering principle. And Justice Clarence Thomas, who had entered the studio expecting to deliver a comfortable lecture to a grateful audience, sat in stunned silence, finally understanding the full scope of his miscalculation. The evening that had begun as a routine discussion of constitutional principles had become something else entirely, a masterclass in accountability, a demonstration of what happens when preparation meets principle, and a reminder that in America, no one, regardless of position, power, or prestige, stands above the obligation to answer for their actions. As the cameras continued rolling and the seconds ticked toward commercial break, one truth had become inescapably clear. This moment would be remembered, analyzed, and referenced for years to come as the night when accountability came calling for one of the most powerful figures in American government. And it had arrived in the form of a 40-year-old congresswoman with a manila folder and an unshakable commitment to the principle that public service means exactly that. Service to the public, not to oneself.